now 8 minutes to 7. There have been many comparisons made between the new leadership of the Labour Party and the hard-left militants who were prominent in the 80s. But perhaps there's another comparison that should be made, and that's with Margaret Thatcher and Keith Joseph a decade earlier. They, supported by the grassroots of the party and in the face of opposition from their fellow MPs, won many over to their brand of conservatism. So how did they do it, and are there any lessons for the new Labour leadership? Well, one of the things they did was to set up a think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies, and we're joined by one of its former directors, David Willetts, who's since been a minister and now runs another think tank, the Resolution Foundation. He's in our London studio, and here in our Brighton studio joining me is Nick Pearce, who's the director of the left-leaning think tank, the IPPR, which provided the bedrock to much of the Blair government's thinking in the 90s, although it was set up in the 80s. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
David Willetts, give us a bit of a history lesson, first of all, on the importance of the CPS, the Centre for Policy Studies, to Thatcher.
Well, back in 1975, before I was involved, Margaret Thatcher, when she ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party, at the same time wanted to win a battle of ideas and literally set up the CPS. She personally screwed the plaque on the outside wall and, with Keith Joseph, commissioned a whole series of reports and ideas. And then when I was involved in the 80s, we did a lot of work, for example, on privatisation. So, yeah, ultimately, ideas do shape politics, and she recognised that. I think the one a very important difference from Jeremy Corbyn, apart perhaps from about the quality of the ideas, is also that she had, remember, been elected by the Conservative Parliamentary Party. Although she was controversial and a lot of people didn't agree with her, she actually had gone through that process where there was a shadow cabinet with many of whom had actually supported her. Whereas I think part of the reasons for the way Jeremy Corbyn is trying to construct policy in Labour now, he's having to completely bypass the Parliamentary Party because very few of those people voted for him.
Well, from your point of view, Nick Pearce, from the IPPR, it was important in the sort of development of Blairism.
Yes, I think people had seen the success of the right-wing think tanks in the late 70s and 80s as being outriders for the Thatcherite project, and of having sort of furnished a lot of the intellectual energy for it, and they wanted to see something similar. And of course, by the early 90s, Thatcher had gone, that project was exhausted, the Conservatives were staggering on, but a lot of the intellectual energy passed to the centre-left, and it was a moment when a lot of rethinking was undertaken. It sort of gathered a lot of intellectual currents around it. And importantly, I think David's right, ideas matter in politics, and parties have to be places where ideas can percolate, and you don't get successful political projects unless you've got that kind of movement of ideas happening around it and within it.
But that is exactly what Jeremy Corbyn is proposing and saying he wants to have now. Yeah,
I think the interesting thing will be whether you can gather people around a project which he's been quite settled on for some time. I mean, ironically, he wants to sort of return to sort of pre-Thatcher, to reverse Thatcherism. And the issue will be, well, has that got the future in its bones? I mean, where is the kind of, as Eric Osborne once said, the famous historian, where does the future come from? And that's the test.
You mean it's not a thrashing out of ideas because he knows what he thinks?
Well, in a sense, yes, but also, is this a project which is of the moment? I mean, Thatcher kind of grasped some currents in history and used them to her advantage. She could see the wave of change, the decline of the industrial working class, globalisation starting, individual liberalism, percolating through society, and she harnessed all of that. And the challenge for Corbyn, well, has he got that too? Are there things in the future which he's pointing to? And I'm not sure that's the case. I think he's taken a lot of democratic energy and harnessed to a fairly statist dirigist project, and the test for him will be whether that's true or not.
David Willetts, you make the point that there was an appetite among Margaret Thatcher's MPs to hear what she was saying and the direction she was travelling in, which you say is not the case now for Jeremy Corbyn. That will hinder him? I mean, can you change a party if your MPs are not with you?
I think it's very hard, of course. Margaret Thatcher, I recognise, had a lot of opposition in the Parliamentary Party, but the thing is, she had been through the process. She had been a cabinet minister under Edward Heath. Keith Joseph, her great intellectual guru, had served as a very prominent cabinet minister. They had been part of collective responsibility. They had voted for things. Sometimes they had agreed with them, but then their ideas had shifted because they'd seen the collapse of this model of trying to run the economy with pay policies and dividend controls and price control. So in other words, they were on an intellectual journey that they were sharing with lots of colleagues because they'd started on it together with an attempts in the 60s and 70s to deliver policies that didn't work. Jeremy Corbyn, by contrast, has completely opted out from this for the last 30 years. He's not had to sit and make the inevitable compromises of office. And I think that's going to make it harder for him to carry his parliamentary colleagues with him.
But Nick Pearce, it's hard for the rest of his MPs not to take account of that huge public support he has. I mean, he is drawing people to the party like nobody's done in decades.
Well, I'm not sure he's reinvented a social movement. I mean, the party membership has grown, but the selectorate for the election was less than it was in the mid-90s. This is the problem. The social bases underpinning the Labour Party collapsed. It's not a mass movement anymore. Neither is the Conservative Party, has to be said. The political party model is not one that exists anymore. What he has done is harness a real discontent with contemporary politics, with established politics.
And we're talking more than 60,000 new members since he was elected in the last couple of weeks.
Absolutely true. And he is saying to the Labour Party, look, you've become hollowed out and technocratic and centrist. You're not inspiring anybody anymore. And the challenge for the moderates is to go along with his leadership because he has a mandate, but also to recognise that that's a critique of them.
And remember as well that Margaret Thatcher solved a real political problem. If Conservatives could not deliver pay deals with trade unions, they needed a different way of running the economy. She solved a real political problem as also being right.
David Willetts, Nick Pearce, thank you.
And at 7:03, it's time for the weather. Darren Bett is with us. Morning.
Good morning. High pressure in charge of the weather today and probably right the way through the rest of this week. It's going to keep it dry. There'll be some pleasant sunshine around.